told the Reuters news agency that there has been no decision on anything and that Turkey expressed the strongest reservations. Here's NPR's Philip Reeves.
The operation against the regime of Colonel Muammar Gaddafi is in its 5th day. The nations taking part still haven't agreed who will be in command. Key players, including the US, Britain and Italy, want NATO to take charge. James Blitz, diplomatic editor of the Financial Times, says others disagree.
The problem you've got is that there are two countries, France and Turkey in particular, which have never wanted there to be a very strong NATO hand over the whole operation.
Turkey is a member of NATO, yet it's also strongly critical of aspects of US and Western foreign policy, which is one reason why, says Blitz, Turkey doesn't want the alliance to be in charge.
Turkey's fundamental problem is it doesn't particularly like the idea of NATO getting involved in an incursion in Africa and the Middle East. And it's also got a very hostile approach to the international operation in Libya. It basically is highly resistant to what is happening.
After today's NATO meeting, the Turkish foreign minister said it was impossible for Turkey to share responsibility for an operation some described as a crusade. Norway is also not happy. It's among the NATO countries who want the alliance to have command. It's now threatening to withdraw the 6 fighter jets it's committed to the operation. The attack on Libya was launched with extraordinary speed, just 2 days after the United Nations Security Council passed a resolution authorizing a no-fly zone. There was no time for the coalition leaders to complete negotiations over command and control. Talks have been short, sometimes short-tempered. In the last few days, this was clear tensions within the alliance. The ambassadors from Germany and France walked out of NATO in London. Since then, tempers have cooled, and the French seem to have softened their stance. They now want the operation to be overseen by a political steering body comprising the main countries involved and the Arab League. NATO's role should be technical, they say, although this means providing military command and control. Young Techno, a security policy expert with the Carnegie Endowment, said that would still mean NATO is center stage in the operation. The technical aspects of NATO headquarters and command structures, that will always be the backbone of the operational kind of layer. And then the big question is about, political leadership. The French want to play down NATO's involvement because they believe the Arab world dislikes the alliance. The sparse involvement of Arab nations is still one of the coalition's biggest worries. Britain's Prime Minister David Cameron told Parliament today that Qatar's sent a couple of Mirage jets. He said Kuwait and Jordan are offering logistical help, and he's been talking to Saudi Arabia. But Cameron said he'd like more.
I hope further support will be forthcoming, but I would be clear about this. Because we had to act so quickly on Saturday, it wasn't possible to bring forward as much Arab support as perhaps would have been welcomed, I think, by everybody in this House.
Tekau says the question of who takes command of the Libya operation is just one of many issues facing the coalition. He thinks its long-term goals in Libya are still very unclear and need to be defined. That's the next grand question that NATO has to answer. No matter what the compromise looks like that they're going to hammer out, the big question remains, what is the political goal in Libya? Coalition leaders are to meet in London next week. That question is sure to come up, along with many others. The Briefs, NPR News, London.
Western airstrikes have devastated Gaddafi's anti-aircraft systems and destroyed at least one armored column in eastern Libya. But the situation on the ground remains essentially unchanged. The rebels have regained control of their self-styled capital, Benghazi, but their efforts to expand westward have been thwarted by Gaddafi's forces. We're now going to hear from two of our correspondents inside Libya. First, NPR's Eric Westerveld is in Benghazi. Eric, you've been down to the front line south of Benghazi. How would you assess the situation there?
Well, Robert, the rebels out there have not been able to take advantage really at all of the big help from Western airstrikes. Today they were actually pushed back a little by pro-Gaddafi forces. There was fighting around the port area of Zlaytina, a strategic oil port just north of Gaddafi. So they've actually lost ground in the last 24 hours. Gaddafi's army still has tanks and artillery and heavy armor sort of entrenched in the town of Gaddafi, and they're using it to great effect against this sort of lightly armed and disorganized force. The rebels continue to call for patience and to give us time. We're working to get our act together, but they really have no effective communication system still, no coherent strategy, no effective leadership. They're not trained soldiers, and they're not effective fighters, and they're getting beat.
Okay, that's Eric Westerveld, who's in Benghazi. Hang on the line, Eric. We're going to go to the capital, Tripoli, where NPR's David Green is. David, what's the Libyan government saying about the situation on the ground?
You know, Robert, it's interesting to hear Eric talk about the rebels as a sort of a loosely held together group with little communications, because you listen to the Libyan government and they're painting these rebels as, real warriors over the last few days, especially in the east where Eric is. The Libyan government has said they're really at a disadvantage because the rebels, they have planes, they have tanks, and the Libyan government says that the United States, Britain has been giving the rebels air cover, and that the government's in a position where if they fight back, they'll be called murderers by the rest of the world. And so they're playing the victim card a little bit. I should probably mention one other place, and that's Misrata, which is a western city that it's one of the few places the rebels have held on to in the west. The government takes a different picture. You know, they've been accused of really going after civilians. Some of the reports from Misrata have been pretty horrific. Government snipers and civilians being shot at. The government says that they are going after Islamist extremists who are holed up with civilians in that city. It's hard to know the truth because international aid groups, journalists have effectively been locked out of that city by the government, so that the government's able to really tell the story the way it wants to.
That's David Green in Tripoli. And now back to Eric Westerveld in Benghazi. Eric, the rebel leadership today announced the appointment of a prime minister. His name is Mahmoud Jabril. What do you know about him? What can you tell us about his appointment?
Well, Robert, he's an American-educated former professor who once headed Libya's Economic Development Board, and he's already director of the Rebels Crisis Committee, which covers military and foreign affairs, as well. He was appointed prime minister today, not elected. The provisional leaders you talk to do say this is necessary to try to get greater recognition from the international community, to show that we're organized, and they're certainly better organized as a government than they are as a fighting force, and to try to set the stage, they say, for a transition to democracy, and to show that there's an alternative to the Gaddafi regime that's starting to get organized.
I'd just like to hear from both of you. We'll start with David Green in Tripoli, and then Eric Westerveld in Benghazi. What is life like in these cities now? Are people buying things and going to work, or is everything stopped now that the country is in an effective state of war? David?
You know, Robert, we actually got our first look at parts of the city we haven't seen before. The government took us on a bus trip today, suggesting they were going to show us places where there were civilian casualties from these airstrikes. They failed. They didn't end up taking us anywhere. They turned around and took us back to the hotel. But it gave us a chance to take in some of the scenes of the city. And a lot of shops are closed. A lot of the roads were fairly empty. And so you are getting a sense that people are fearful right now. But it really, the routine is at night, after sundown, is when the airstrikes have come every single night, the last 4 nights. And I think people are ready for that. As when darkness comes, they're ready for the noise to come.
And Eric, what's it like in Benghazi?
Very few shops are open. People are tense and nervous. We hear nightly clashes, gunfire and explosions, and sometimes firefights in the middle of the night. The city is not back to normal. Everyone's focused on the fight down the road, how they can support it, either strategically or physically by going out to the front. And things certainly are not back to normal here.
Well, thanks to both of you, and take care.
Thank you, Robert. Thank you, Robert.
It's NPR's Eric Westerveld in Benghazi, Libya, and David Green in the Libyan capital, Tripoli.
Army Specialist Jeremy Morlock has pleaded guilty to 3 counts of premeditated murder for his role in a conspiracy to kill Afghan civilians for sport. The 22-year-old from Wasilla, Alaska, was part of an Army unit that's been dubbed the Kill Squad for their alleged conspiracy to ambush and murder apparent non-combatants. NPR's Martin Costi has been at the court-martial at the unit's home base near Tacoma, Washington. And Martin, tell us more about this guilty plea today, 3 counts of premeditated murder.
Yes, today in court, Specialist Morlock recounted for the judge what he recalled, to the best of his knowledge, to make sure it scanned with the information the court had. Basically, he said that he and other soldiers killed 3 Afghan men on 3 separate occasions last year. This is in Kandahar province. He says they planted drop weapons on the victims' corpses or next to the corpses to make it look like the killings were legitimate. They called them scenarios. In one case, they referred to the pineapple scenario, which was a case in which he and another soldier detonated a grenade near an Afghan man, shot him, and then planted a Russian grenade that's called a pineapple next to his body. Make it look as though he'd thrown the first grenade.
And apart from Specialist Morlock, how many other soldiers are implicated in this?
12 soldiers have been implicated in this investigation so far, but only 5 of those are facing murder charges, and Morlock is the first of those 5 to go to court-martial. he's the first because he's cut a deal. He's got a plea bargain with the prosecutors. He's agreed to testify against other soldiers, and especially a staff sergeant named Calvin Gibbs, who's been portrayed, at least in court here, as the instigator of this whole conspiracy to kill non-combatants. According to Morlock, Gibbs arrived in late 2009 and started bragging about doing similar things in Iraq, said he got away with it and wanted to start doing it in Afghanistan.
And with this guilty plea today, Martin, what kind of sentence does Morlock face?
Well, Morlock would have faced life in prison without possibility of parole if he'd been convicted straight out, but because of this plea bargain, if the plea bargain holds together, he will face a maximum of 24 years in prison. That is, if the bargain holds together.
And let's talk about the negative publicity surrounding this case, in particular some horrifying pictures that were recently released.
Yeah, this has really complicated things for the Army in Afghanistan. They've had to apologize in the past for the killing of civilians in combat, and then this. These photos appear to be trophy photos that some members of this unit took of the victims of these killings. They had been kept under wraps. The Army tried to confiscate all copies, but just this past weekend, some of the photos were leaked. No one can say from whom, but they were leaked to the German news magazine Der Spiegel, and now they're on the internet. There are 3 photos so far, and one of them shows Specialist Morlock holding up the head of one of the Afghan men for the camera. This is him posing with a corpse, which violates military justice.
Okay, Martin, thank you.
You're welcome.
It's NPR's Martin Acosti at the Joint Base Lewis McChord near Tacoma, Washington, talking about the guilty plea for Army Specialist Jeremy Morlock in a court-martial today.